Welcome everyone to Fireside Adoptees Adoptee Fire Series. This is a special interview with a member of the Constellation who's not an adoptee, but I'd like to welcome our guest, Lori Holden, also goes by the beautiful epithet of LavenderLuz. Lori is an adoptive parent of two children. She hails from Denver. She hosts a podcast called Adoption, the Long View. And the aim of that podcast is to help adoptive parents understand complexities around adoption earlier in their journey as adoptive parents. She's also the author of The Open-Hearted Way to Open Adoption, which she wrote with her daughter's birth mother. We're really happy to have Lori here today, and thank you so much for joining us, Lori. I'd like to start just with a couple questions here that, because we've tended to be interviewing adoptees specifically up to this point, with a couple exceptions. I'd like for you to talk a little bit about, to the degree that you feel comfortable, your story as an adoptive parent. What we like to respect, of course, and I know you agree with this, is that adoptees themselves are the only ones with the right to tell their own story, but certainly you as an adoptive parent have a journey as well. And I'm wondering if you can share with us about what that's been for you.
Sure. And first, let me just say I'm so grateful and honored to enter into this space. I understand the sanctity of it, and the invitation is really meaningful to me. I am a little bit nervous because I know how a complex adoption is. It's hard to talk about it. We could do politics or religion instead, perhaps, but I do want to say that the welcome that I've gotten in the weeks leading up to this has really fit in with what Jim Gritter talks about in his book, Hospicious Adoption. And he uses the model of guest and host, what makes a good host, what makes a good guest. And in adoption, how at the beginning, the expectant mom is the literal physical host of things. And in the way we do adoption today, she chooses the next host at the table. And then the host for several years becomes the adoptive parents. But the ultimate and the last host is the adoptee. And they get to decide later who's been at their table. And they've been modeled what good hosting looks like, what good guesting looks like. So all that is just to say, thank you for the great hosting and welcome me in as a guest here. And anyway.
That was really a thoughtful thing to say. I appreciate that. And it shows a lot of respect for the people in the adoptee community that you would approach it that way. Would you like to share, to the degree you feel comfortable, a little bit about your story as an adoptive parent?
We came to adoption through infertility, through domestic infant adoption through infertility. I'm starting to make the distinction of domestic infant adoption and the wider world of adoption, because I think the dynamics are a little different depending on where adoptive parents enter into that. We were so I have almost two tracks for that question. One is my personal track, and that is what happened to us and how we navigated becoming parents. We were the beneficiaries of the Infant Adoption Training Initiative, which was something the federal government did put out through agencies. We had this in the early aughts, in the early part of the century. And it blew my mind when the agency started talking about open adoption. I hadn't really heard much of it before. I wasn't in adoption world at all before. I'd had friends who had been adopted. I had one girl in high school who went away, but I hadn't really given it much thought. In fact, I was probably thinking at that time, just adopt, just adopt. It's no big deal. So we got this as part of the home study process. It's quite a process. You go through the process. At the very end, before you activate your profile, you need to go through 3 days of adoption school. This is how it was at my agency here in Colorado anyway. Colorado is an agency state. So in this adoption school, they taught us about open adoption, and it made so much sense to me because I had watched my friend, in particular, I was close to one girlfriend who had been in a closed adoption from the 60s, and she didn't know anything. And she kind of didn't wonder. And I always wondered why she didn't wonder. She was wondering, she just wasn't free to wonder. Yes. And I found that out now in talking with her. So I really love this idea of open adoption because it was going to be better for me. It was going to be better for me because if my children, who I loved and raised and poured everything into, suddenly at age 18 wanted to go live somewhere else or go search somebody out, that wouldn't happen to me. I could keep it close all the way through. So my embracing of that at first was more of a self-protective measure. But then one of the exercises they had us do, and I do this in the trainings that I lead now with agencies, is to, it's called a family sculpting exercise. Those of you who are into therapy or social work might know of this thing where they had us in the class all be players in an adoption scene. Some of us were the adopting parents, some of us were the expectant parents, some of us were the parents of the parents, and one of us was the baby. I was chosen as the baby. When I got chosen, my first thought was, oh, this will be so easy. I'll just want to move over to my adoptive parents. But what they do is along the way, they do, like, do you remember the game Statue that we used to play as kids where you run around and then stop? Well, they do that stop at different places along the adoption, the timeline, where here you are, you've just submitted here you are finding out you're infertile. Here you are telling your people you're infertile. Here you are doing this. The expectant parents are going through the same thing. Here you are finding out you're pregnant. Here you are telling your family you're pregnant. Here you are making a decision what to do with the pregnancy. And here you are looking at profiles. Here you are meeting each other. Here you are at the hospital. Here you are going home. One with full arms, one with empty arms. As the baby in these scenes, I did not, I threw myself into it. I did not immediately want my adoptive parents. I really wanted to stay with the mom who I was with.
Really interesting. Wow.
Yeah. So I think our agency did a really good job with that training, because it shifted me, and then I was all in with openness. And then it was really helpful because I just happened to really like the woman who picked us. We ended up not waiting very long. A week after we turned our profile in, we got the call, and a couple of days later we met Crystal, and I just liked her. It was easy. And our daughter was born about 10 days later. My husband and I got to be there. And there was not a hard part in that part of the story. Birth father was not around for various reasons. I sought him out. I finally got the green light from Crystal to approach him when our daughter was maybe 6 or 7. Our daughter has a birth sibling on either side, at least one. 2 years after we adopted our daughter, we looked into adopting our son. It took a little bit longer. It was in the aftermath of 9/11. And his birth mom ended up not really wanting, he was already born. So I didn't get to recreate that high experience I had. And I think I grieved that for a while. But his birth mom didn't really, she seemed to have gotten the advice or somehow internalized, just move on. So I also had to grieve that, because in my fantasy, I wanted this extended family where Crystal and my son's birth mom and we all got along and we all did things together. And that's not her. And I had to be okay with that. What I came up with is calling it an open door adoption. If you can't have an open adoption, have an open door adoption, where you just keep sending out invitations once in a while and being open to things changing. The last one in was my son's birth father. I tracked him down too. And he was so excited to be in. And he, in the current day, 20 years later, is probably the most present. My son got to be in his wedding a few summers ago. My son has more birth siblings on either side. So that's kind of the personal arc. The other story that I think is worth mentioning is my online work. I joined online forums before Facebook had even left Harvard. And I got onto, I don't know if I can say it, but it's one of the biggies. It's where people met cross triad before Facebook. And it was like I don't know if you've ever had the experience of scuba diving or snorkeling, and you go underwater and you just see all this stuff is there and it's always been there and it'll always be there and you never even knew it. That's what it felt like to me to leave my landlubber life, which is adoptive parent narratives. That's all I knew, and go under the water and see there was all this other stuff going on. So I started to get educated. It felt like I got educated the first year. What I was able to take in was from birth parents. I really wanted to understand what it was like for Crystal, how I could help her heal, help her whatever, how I could do this well. And I was shocked to find, this is crazy, but I was shocked to find all the hurt. I was shocked to find it was so hard. I was shocked to find that even if she had chosen adoption, if it was willfully done, it was because all the other choices were so terrible I just didn't get it because I'd never heard that storyline before. So I listened and listened and listened and listened to a whole bunch of different people's story. That probably was about a year in my learning. And then I started being able to absorb adoptee voices. And the thing I want to say about that is I am so grateful to Adoptee Voices for early on letting me know not to share my children's stories. They didn't catch me way before everything, or I wasn't caught. It was not, they didn't do anything wrong, but I listened, I heard, and I stopped sharing likenesses. You cannot Google anything in my writing or my books and find my children through the names that I've used. I've been very careful not to do pictures, not 100%, but once I found out, I strategized and I heard loud and clear, don't caretake their stories well, because you can't put it back. And especially this was the early part of the internet and nobody knew where it was going. So I am so grateful. My children don't know that you all did this for them. But I also use that as a way to teach them about their own digital footprint. And I never tagged them in anything. Now that they're older and I feel like they have the informed consent that they can make, they tag me sometimes. But I have tried really hard not to cross streams and let my public face and my private face cross. So
that's very, it's beyond thoughtful. I think it's something adoptees listening will say that they really appreciate that you've done that and been so careful with the stories of your children.
Well, I owe it to adoptees. I would not have seen that. I would not have seen that far forward.
Thank you for saying that. I feel like as I've listened, I was drawn back to you being the baby in the agency. Did the other hopeful adoptive parents get a chance to be the baby also?
We did the exercise once. There were 6 couples in the class, so 12 of us, and I think there were 9 people in the scenes. Maybe there were 13. No, there couldn't have been 13. When I do it, I try to include more people, but only one gets to be the baby. That was a pivotal moment in my parenting life. If I hadn't had that, I don't know what might have been different.
Actually, what I was wondering, I was saddened by the thought that I didn't think many people had that opportunity to have participated the way you did.
Yeah.
And what a difference it might have made for them if they had been in that situation as well, the way you were. And what a difference it might have made potentially in the lives of children they adopted.
I think this is a key part of everything in adoption world, including what you're trying to do here with Fireside, is to see from other people's shoes. And because the adoptive parenting narrative has been the prevalent one for so long, everybody knows that, or everybody knows maybe a caricature of it. I will say that I think if we as an adoption community want to take this to the next level, I think I think it would be helpful, and this is why I'm really glad you invited me, to understand the adoptive parent perspective in conjunction with criticizing adoptive parents. One of the best pieces of relationship advice I ever got was through some marriage counseling. Excuse me, I get choked up too. And that is assume best intent. People are usually doing the best they can most of the time. And that's really helpful with partners. It's really helpful with your child. I mean, we as parents are expected to do this with our child. If they're misbehaving, if something's going wrong, there's a reason. They are doing the best they can in that moment. And I would pose to you also that most of the criticisms I see of adoptive parents of the past and of the present, they were probably doing the best that they could with what they had at the time. The narrative was not good for adoptive parents either. For everybody to pretend nothing had happened, to pretend that the woman hadn't had a childectomy and expect that was going to be okay, to pretend that this grafting on the family tree had never happened and to think that was going to go well, to pretend that the big switcheroo for you as an adoptee hadn't happened and to ignore it. All that pretending was, well, we know the Georgia Tan part of it, but also because we had all that shame, we had to protect the child from shame. So we had these policies that disconnected them from their identity and their roots and their heritage. And well-meaning though, it was to protect them from the shame that was there, you know? So adoptive parents, for the most part, are not evil. I think there are you're in any population, you're going to have the narcissists, you're going to have the people who can't deal with things. And expect you to be their everything. That's just emotional unintelligence. I don't know that adoptive parents are more emotionally unintelligent than everybody else, but they have had an added layer of something they've had to deal with. And if they never dealt with it, what can you expect?
And I'd like to ask you about that specifically later on, because it is such a key thing, and it is potentially an incendiary thing for adoptees at times because of the associated trauma around infertility. So I'd like to speak with you about that a little bit later. Yeah. I was wondering, some of the research I've done and the interaction with you personally, you've talked a lot about the space that you've been able to give your adopted children to feel and process and express. But I'm sure that raises or can raise potential insecurities for an adoptive parent. Is it hard not to fill in the space that gets created when they're processing? Is it hard not to jump in and possibly interject or insinuate insecurity into what they might be processing? Does that ever get difficult?
Yeah, I think what you're asking is what happens when my kids trigger me and my brain goes offline.
Sure.
Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yes.
And I feel like that, I mean, yeah, they did that all the time. They still do it even as adults. But I will say not so much in the realm of adoption. That training was so powerful to me. And I was just really determined to be the best mom I could to them. I had this intuitive hit that for me to be there for them in the way they needed it, I needed to clean myself out. And it's not a thing you do one time. It's a continual clearing of a channel. And for me to make good decisions about birth parents being in and out, and having good discernments about that, I had to know where I was coming from. And I was wired to do that. But that doesn't mean that they didn't hit my other triggers. I have other things. Yeah, I was going to say one, but I'm not going to.
Okay. Understand.
But my children know where they are, and I'm working on them, and it's hard. But the insecurity and the fear, that was not difficult for me. I understand why it is for some people. I had therapy. I had a lot of therapy.
Yeah, that's great. I think it did manifest for my parents in the sense that so I'm a baby scoop era adoptee, and I heard nothing about my adoption growing up. Didn't even find out about it until I was 10 years old. And then I heard nothing else about it until I was in my 20s. So but I have to extend to them, I'm going to use the word charitability here, which I think goes along with what you've expressed, assuming that they were doing the best they could. The climate at the time in the baby scoop era, and from the experts at the time, was not to engage your children about adoption, not to discuss it, not basically what you said, act like it didn't happen. And they were told that was the best thing for the child. And it's not. I know you know that, and I know people know that. It creates indelible problems, unfortunately, as we're all aware of in the adoptee community and in the constellation, that there are things that come up that don't subside with time, unfortunately, because of the impact to the nervous system of relinquished infants, to trauma, unfortunately, in far too many adoptive situations after that, adoption trauma specifically. But it feels like the reality is that people adopt. They do.
And often they're broken people.
Yeah.
Because they've had this like challenge to their identity, their personhood, their purpose. Yeah.
It seems like with your particular, I'm going to use the word mindful because I know that's an important word for you, but it may have positioned you in an advantageous way to deal with your children as they were experiencing these things growing up. And certainly, again, is out of respect for their story, I'm not asking for anything specifically about that, but your presence or your ability to engage them as they grew up, did you find that helped them through inevitably the identity issues and other complexities that they were experiencing growing up?
I think the training I had before even getting this is before even meeting my husband, I had a spiritual practice that included making space, holding space.
Yeah, it's a big one.
And entering into non-judgment. And this probably started in my 20s. So I've had a lot more practice with it now, but I had a foundation of that. And that's kind of what I fell back on in really tough moments with my children. And because it was a practice, it's like what I automatically did. I think somebody came in from a yoga studio. Was that Donna? Yeah, Danielle. And when you make something a practice, it becomes your habit. And then that's your go-to when you get stressed. So I think that really helped. I did write on my blog about a couple of times when my children went through those hard parts. Like I remember, and there's a story on there, and I was trying to tell it from my perspective without violating my children. But there was one time when we were out to dinner, my family and Crystal and her son. And all of a sudden my daughter, I can't remember how old she was, maybe 6 or 7, said, "Okay, Mom, you've had your turn. Now I'm going to go live with Crystal for a while." So this is let's make space for this.
Yeah.
What's the best? Before you respond, you have to tune in. That's probably the first thing, is tune in and say, what's going on? First of all, she can't do it. It's not because I was keeping her from it. It's just not, for various reasons, it's not going to happen. So then the next thing is, how do we listen to her first and then bring her wish along with reality? And luckily, I mean, this is one of the great things about open adoption is Crystal is there to be part of it. And one of my big things is don't split the baby. And so Crystal and I were on the same side of it without our daughter feeling pulled one way or the other. So we were walking out of the restaurant and we said, "Oh, honey, it sounds like you're really missing Crystal. Maybe we can have some more visits. Is there anything you want to tell us about?" And then she kind of did. And then we're like, we're really sorry, but it just doesn't work like that where you flip families, but we can find some ways to get you some more connection with Crystal. And so that's an example of the kind of the process that we use because it was a practice.
Yeah. It leads directly into what I wanted to hit on, which is we don't hear a lot of success stories about open adoption. So what can go wrong? Why do you think you were able to successfully navigate open adoption?
That's a really good question. I haven't thought about that. I have come to, in working with lots and lots of agencies and training lots and lots of pre-adoptive and post-adoptive parents over the years, I have come to see that there's a distinction between what I think would make a healthy adoptive parent and one that's not quite there yet. And if I could wave a magic wand and decide who gets to pass a home study, it would be the people who demonstrate openness, curiosity, and an ability to go there, as opposed to these people. I've started calling them Olivia and Oliver open, and Carl and Carla closed. So you can pick up this vibe in people. And this is somebody who's protecting something. This is somebody who hasn't worked out their own stuff yet. And it's not all infertility stuff. Sometimes it's the way they were parented. It's what they come to parenting with. It's their own attachment wounds that go way beyond even their family building story, way before. So I think a sense of curiosity and openness is what set me on the path, and getting to be the baby.
Yeah.
That perspective change, that shift in perspective. And what I try to do in my trainings with agencies is to embody, not just get people to think about it, but if you can get them to embody it. I mean, it's much better when I can do this in person than on Zoom, but we can do ways where they're embodying their feelings. They never forget it. And you see it blow people open, the way I got blown open.
Wow. That's very powerful. Do you feel that, and I think you kind of addressed this by talking about open and open door. You have two children from different families, and different eventualities or different things precipitated from their biological families that made open adoption not equally the same thing for both of them.
Yeah.
Does it lead to a disparity, not in the treatment of the children, but in how you have to approach each one of these situations? As my children have different adoptions, separate adoptions. I have to face this as a reality.
Yeah, this is one of the top questions I get from adoptive parents is, what do? We already have one really open adoption. What if we get another one that she doesn't want to be around? How would we handle that with our second child, or the other way around? And I was just training on this at an adoption camp this weekend. Parents already know how to do this. Parents already know how to deal with inequality and inequity in parenting. So one of the techniques I teach is called reframing. Because adoption is so emotionally charged, if we can kind of reimagine or reframe the situation without the adoption piece in it, then maybe we can come up with a solution or path. So what are some other ways that adoptive parents are faced with something that's inequitable? And the easy one would be soccer. One of your kids makes the soccer team and the other doesn't. One of them gets placed into advanced math group and the other one doesn't. So parents have to navigate that and figure that out. And it's not the same. I am not minimizing the amount of, that parent contact is on the same level as those kinds of things. But I am saying that you can't bring down the one that's got the abundance, and you can't bring up the one that's got the lack. And so all that's left is to meet each child where they are and give space for the feelings around it.
That's a great response as well. Thank you. Excuse me. Let's talk about allyship, advocacy, and centering of adoptees. Can you tell me what each of those means for you?
I've watched this in the BIPOC space too. And I don't think I can tell you like great definitions or anything.
Oh, certainly not expected. Just
I think,
personal impression of, yeah.
And I've had my own journey of, I think I started as an ally. I think what I'd like to be is an accomplice. I've learned a lot from Angela Tucker, who I presented with yesterday on centering the adoptee. I think her hashtag is center the adoptee.
Yeah.
So bringing adoptees in whenever an adoptee can share that insight better than I can do it. But I think I have a role to play in it too, in talking with specifically adoptive parents, because I understand that piece of it too. So when we were talking just yesterday to a group of adoptive parents, they loved hearing from Angela about her experience of being an adoptee, because they all strive to be the best adoptive parent they can. They want that insight from her. But she hasn't parented an adoptee. So I can tell them also, like when somebody asked a question yesterday, Angela gave her perspective and I was able to give a different perspective. But they both aligned. They were not opposite, I should say. So I don't know, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
It's not talking over as I talk over you.
Oh yeah, and that's actually, I'm glad you phrased it this way, talking over, because that does happen, unfortunately, too many times in our spaces. And when I say in our spaces, I mean even in adoptee specific spaces, let's say on different platforms where there's not the privacy or the private group setting that we have on Facebook, for example. It's not uncommon for people to come into adoptee spaces where a conversation is happening. And whether they mean to or not, they pull the conversation away from the people speaking, place it back on the adoptive parents, or sometimes, not often, but sometimes on the first parents. And it can leave the adoptees feeling disenfranchised and muted in a lot of ways. And unfortunately, it's a larger societal narrative that we have to face and combat and chip away at. And it leads, I think, to my next question, which is, you've probably, since you've been engaged in this for a long time now, seen shifts in what advocacy looks like for adoptees. Do you have any thoughts on how it looks different as a landscape than maybe it did when you first started?
Oh yeah, it's huge. The amount of content available when you're searching out adoptee voices is huge. It used to be blogs, and I think blogs have gone the way of now they're all podcasts. There's so many podcasts. Sure. I just got into another one, and I listened to an episode right before we started. It's called Adoption: The Making of Me, and I just love how the two hosts are reading adoptee-centered oriented books. At the same time, they're telling adoptee stories. So that's how I've been walking my dog for the last couple of months. I'm going to catch all the way up, and there's just so much more content out there. So many more people approachable and educating us adoptive parents. It was harder to find before. They were always there. It was harder for me to find.
And there seems, I think a lot of people in the adoptee community would agree with this, that there almost seems like a groundswell lately of rising adoptee consciousness about finally getting to be heard, having a seat at the table, since the conversation is about what happens to us. And we're not used to being able to say that.
Yeah.
But with the perspective that you've had here and the openness and the charitability you're displaying here, that would drive this conversation forward in incredible ways for more people to be open that way and respectful of what's going on, and realize that when adoptees talk about being centered, it's not for selfish purposes. It may seem to some people like an overcorrection. It's not. It's of course due to being perpetually infantilized. Even the language we have here, adopted children, adopted children, always has this connotation of an infant or a small kid. And so we're adopted adults. We didn't stop being adopted. It doesn't come to an end for us or for adoptive parents. but it feels like there's a growing consciousness, at least I see it for sure in the adoptee community, of people are coming into their voices now and finding a place and even rising to a social awareness level that you're seeing outlets that cover popular news stories, et cetera. They're finally saying, oh, listen to what these people are saying. There's a lot of pushback to it for sure. People don't want to accept what's being said, but at least the voices are now finding a place, and that I don't think could have been said very many years ago. So I was really interested to see how that experience had developed for you. So I appreciate your thoughts on that.
Yeah, Adoptee Twitter it has been just this huge trajectory. And I think there are probably a lot of adoptive parents who watch it, but don't engage because I don't know. I feel like the unspoken rule is we don't engage. We are observers in that room, and I could be wrong on that, but I saw once an adoptee saying adoptive parents cannot use the hashtag adoptee Twitter. So I'm very careful to stay away from hashtags that are not up for me.
And I think this could be a challenging question, which is you're addressing adoptees right now. And we are people who came to have our lives shaped due in many cases to infertility trauma. And for us, it can be a struggle to know our lives became what they are due to the tragedy of someone else not being able to have children. What advice do you have for people who do struggle with infertility in terms of coming to terms with it? Not a solution. I use the problem of adoption as a solution to infertility. And I know these are sensitive topics, but you, I'm sure, are always addressing people who struggle with infertility. How is that for you to be able to address them, and how are your responses received by people you interact with about that?
I think my challenge when I am talking to people who are 20 years behind me in life stage is remembering how painful infertility is. It is an earthquake. It is a tsunami. It is, and I know with this audience right now, it's really maybe unbelievable here that it's a big thing, but it's a big thing on lots of levels. I made it over it. So, I got to the other side, and sometimes I forget because I don't want to go back to the pain. I don't want to go back to how hard it is for them. So having empathy for them for that stage is something I try to do when I'm talking to them. The other thing that I think is sometimes lost in conversations about the bridge from infertility to adopting is that the clock is ticking. And I'm not talking about the biological clock. I'm talking about the clock of the stage in your life when you're pickable by an expectant mom, which is what you know at that moment. You don't look as attractive at age 40 as you do at 39. And so there is a pressure to move on to the next thing, even before, saying you need to heal from infertility before you start to adopt, and you don't know how long the adoption journey is going to be either. That's a really hard thing for somebody to hear. So I do think that the healing, a commitment to a path of healing alongside investigating adoption is okay, because it could take a while to heal. I do make sure that I mention that filling your arms does not address or cure infertility. Becoming a parent is not the same as not being infertile anymore. And there are times, especially early on in parenting, when the pang is still there, when you're in the club, the mom's club, but you aren't talking about breastfeeding, and you don't have a cool birth story, and you're not worried about, this is the cool one, you're not worried about getting your body back, but all those things, you're still on the outside of it. And even now, I will admit, and I've aged out of it, thankfully, I don't like baby showers. It's hard. I have jealousy, I have envy. I know that about myself, and I give myself grace when I say, no, I can't go, I'll send a gift. So I don't know if that answers your question. I think that those are some things I think adoptive parents need to know. And what I would like adoptees to know is that it's not an easy thing to get over. It's hard. And probably in some of the same ways as the adoptee journey of identity and loss. That's one thing we have in common. They're not going to be the same. I'm not, again, I don't want to minimize, but it could be a common ground for talking, is that we both understand something really hard that we've had to triumph over.
Yeah.
That in cards that were dealt to us.
You've spoken about Crystal. Do you have any words for first parents about how, because you're tied or you're disjointed in these relationships, and you've had some of both in what's happened with you? Do you have any words for first parents about this?
Specifically about loss and grief or
about
voice?
open adoption, I guess, is what I would ask.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of them worry that it will close up, or that it's not finding, or they will be hoping for a level of contact that doesn't come out to be the case, for emotional reasons, for all kinds of things. But I know you've probably worked with people that this has been the case that's happened. I was wondering if you could address that a little bit.
Yeah, it's a very real fear. And I know it happens a lot. I don't know that it happens. If there were a research study about it, I don't think it happens as often as the anecdotal evidence I see out there. I can say that what I've seen over the time that I have been working with adopting and adoptive couples or families and singles is that there is movement, there is growth, there is a huge desire to see from the adoptee perspective now, to see from the birth parent perspective, to do right by everybody. I am seeing more and more and more of that as time goes on. I think it's because of adoptee voices being out there, because there are also birth parent voices out there that are accessible, because agencies are catching on. One of the things that concerns me, and if you want to know more about this, go to the hashtag Stop Baby Brokers. Lots of birth moms are involved with that. But what happens now in the era of social media is that the agencies, especially the ethical ones who are doing the pre-adoption education, the post-adoption support, are being bypassed because they're filling roles, they're having expenses, and they're trying to keep costs down. They're being usurped by baby brokers who have lots of money to spend on SEO. So when somebody Googles that they want to adopt a baby or they want to place a baby, they come up at the top. They may not even be in your state. They may not even be an agency, but they are filling the space, charging lots of money and giving no services. So I don't know how I got off on that tangent, but it's
very important.
Yeah, it is really important. I think where I was going is that agencies are doing a better job of educating adopting parents, and to bypass agencies, especially the really ethical ones who are doing the hard work and spending the money to do that. I want to support those agencies. They need to be there. They serve a really important role right now. I would also say to birth parents, back to your original question, to listen to other birth parents, find your voice. I know that a lot of times birth parents are, it's harder for them to tell their stories because they have something at risk, but there are others telling the stories. Twisted Sisterhood is one of my favorites, Kelsey Vandervliet-Renyard and Ashley Mitchell. And I'm sure there's other ones too, but suggest to your child's adoptive parents, listen to these, listen to mine. I have birth parents on my podcast, Adoption in the Long View, because I'm trying to get out there. This is what it's like. This is perhaps why your child's birth mom is showing up unreliably to visits. This is why there's always context to behavior. And if you understand that, if you can make space for it, if you find connection and compassion, you can make this better for your child.
I think I'd just like to know if you have any final words for adoptees before we close the interview. Just a statement that you might like to make.
All I feel is gratitude. I am just grateful. I am grateful to be here. I'm grateful for the adoptees along my path, and I'm grateful for the ones I have yet to have on my path. So thank you for having me today and
We're
for teaching me.
very appreciative of your time and such a thoughtful and heartfelt interaction. So I will close the interview in just a minute here. I'll just thank everybody who's attended and say that it will go up on our YouTube channel, Fireside Adoptees. We're again thankful to Lori Holden, LavenderLuz for being here. And we'll conclude the interview right here. And thank you for attending.